Tonight, some top Democrats saying the president is causing a constitutional crisis by ignoring subpoenas and trying to stop people from testifying. Former federal prosecutor will join us to weigh in. Then we're going to show you the latest way the Trump administration is cracking down on the media. We'll also be speaking with a Washington Post columnist who is caught right in the middle of it all. Also, how the Boston Red Sox visit to the White House, seemingly innocuous, right? Well, it's emblematic of the state of our country and just how divided things have gone. Evening, everybody, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Now, we're going to close out the week exactly, well, where we ended last week. The battle over the Mueller report. Just because the report, largely unredacted, has been delivered, it certainly hasn't answered all the questions. I want you to take a listen to head of the Judiciary Committee, New York's Jerry Nadler.
Eventually, we will hear from Mueller because we will, if we have to, we will subpoena him if we have to. And the nonsense claim of executive privilege will be pierced by the court and he'll be ordered to testify.
Yesterday, President Trump said it is up to the Attorney General, William Barr, to decide whether or not we will hear from Mueller. Now, before that, the president said he wanted Mueller to testify, but then he did a 180, tweeting that no, he shouldn't after all. So it is anyone's guess what will happen with Mueller. Then there's the former White House counsel, Don McGahn. Certainly a lot of people would like to hear what he had to say and whether or not he was or was not pressured to fire Mueller. Nadler, he's threatening McGahn with contempt. The Judiciary Committee subpoenaing McGahn for documents as well as his testimony, but the White House has instructed McGahn not to comply. And speaking of subpoenas, the House Ways and Means Committee, they've just issued one for Trump's tax returns. It's demanding that the Treasury Department hand them over by next Friday. So far, it has been refusing to do just that. Mnuchin, the secretary, said, go jump. Now, James Comey, he, for one, is continuing to speak out about the president. Take a listen to what the former FBI director had to say.
Do you think he should be charged when he's out of office?
I think
based on what Mueller has shown.
Well, I think the Justice Department will have to take a serious look at that. Whether it's a wise thing to do to a former president, I don't know. That's a harder question, a much bigger question than the facts of the case.
But do you think the evidence is there to prosecute?
Sure looks like it's there with respect to at least a couple of those episodes of.
Joining us now is former federal prosecutor Joseph Moreno. And Joe, I want to first start off where Comey went, but also last night I was joined by a good friend to the program, Mimi Rocco, who was a former federal prosecutor herself in the Southern District. And I got the strong impression that of the 14 different cases that we know about that Mueller, in effect, referred out to some of the district courts, plus what they were already working on potentially in the Attorney General of New York, et cetera, the biggest headaches for Trump actually lie with those investigations that are going on. There's far few hurdles they have to answer to. And a private citizen, Trump, certainly has a lot less tools in the toolbox to avoid this than a President Trump. How much concerns do you think a President Trump would have if, in fact, he lost next November? What kind of exposure could he be looking at?
Hey, Richard, good to be with you. So lots of us who've been watching this investigation for the past 2 years always felt that the real danger to President Trump is not so much what Bob Mueller was cooking up here in Washington. It's all the other cases that were spun off, primarily those, as you pointed out, up in the Southern District of New York and in the state of New York, because one, there's no parameters around what they can look for, and two, there's no loyal attorney general kind of keeping an eye on them. So we have often felt like, while certainly Mueller was a danger and continues to be, Trump is not totally out of the woods yet. What's going on in New York, it's largely the unknown that is probably the most worrisome to this president and probably has the most exposure.
In the longer portion of the interview that Congressman Nadler did, and for those who missed in the beginning, he's head of the Judiciary Committee, he didn't just seem like he wanted to hear from Mueller. He was pretty sure he was going to hear from Mueller, and sooner than later. Do you think his optimism is well-founded? And since you're talking about Mueller and hearing from him, go the next step here, whether it be with McGahn or even if we'll hear from Barr in the House.
So I think that my short answer is yes. I think ultimately Congressman Nadler and Congress in general will get what it wants, whether it's documents, whether it's unredacted versions of the report, or whether it's live testimony from Special Counsel Mueller or Don McGahn or anybody else. The problem is going to be it will be a long and hard-fought battle. It's not going to be next week. It's probably not going to be next month. It might be this year. The problem is the courts will have to decide. You're talking about multiple layers of courts, different kinds of arguments depending on who and what Congress is looking for. So you can expect that ultimately it will be resolved in Congress's favor, but it's not going to be anytime soon.
Rudy Giuliani, he's worn many hats, but basically he's the president's attorney here. And for those who forget, Rudy, before he was mayor, he came to prominence as the U.S. attorney. So with that as a backdrop, I want to read about, not Bill and Ted's Great Adventure here, but Rudy's planned trip to the Ukraine and what is behind this. This is what he said in terms of planning to go there to push for inquiries that could help out Trump. And he's open as to the motivations for it. He said, we're not meddling in an election. We're meddling in an investigation, which we have a right to do. There's nothing illegal about it. He's pushing for two different things that he has said openly. One is he wants the investigators investigated, if you will, to try and find the roots of where this probe began. And also he wants to look into Joe Biden's son and any dealings he may have had with a Ukrainian company. Have they learned nothing, Joe, since all the questions about, forget about even collusion, obstruction and everything else, and to do it so brazenly and so proudly? I mean, tell me I'm not the only one who's shocked that Rudy would, A, think about doing this, obviously with the blessing of the president, but then go out and talk so openly about it.
Richard, I've long suspected that the president, while he may have been very frustrated at the fact that the Mueller investigation was going on for so long, he always seemed like he enjoyed keeping it in the headlines. Like he never wanted to be too far away from Russia and Mueller and whether he can fire Mueller and where the investigation was going and what Russia did in the 2016 election. So it really doesn't surprise me that he's doing this. That being said, it's certainly still shocking, especially with Rudy Giuliani, as you pointed out, was the U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York, the same office we're talking about, which is incredibly well thought of. So for him to be out there doing this, is it illegal? Probably not. Is it unseemly? Does it mix politics with justice and national security? Yes. The optics are terrible. I have no expectation he's going to find anything interesting. It just seems like he's keeping this alive for his own reasons, and it's baffling and really unfortunate.
Later on in the program in different parts, I'm talking to a foreign policy expert, mostly on some of the hot spots going on as it relates with North Korea, Iran, and obviously China. But one of the things that's going to come up is the president talking about wanting to charge criminally John Kerry with the Logan Act, even though there's zero evidence. We'll also be talking with a Washington Post reporter who had his press pass basically pulled here because he's on the enemies list, if you will. I know people say constitutional crisis, and some understandably say it's a loaded word. It doesn't have a legal definition, but I always believed that there were some basic checks and balances that the brilliance of the founding fathers installed at the birth of our nation because they didn't want a monarchy. They didn't want a dictator, obviously. I know we're not there, Joe, but the idea that subpoenas don't get answered, the idea that you're going to punish the idea of the temerity of following the rule of law or even examining, the idea that a Senator Burr being on the Intelligence Committee wants to subpoena a family member and now we're going to try and politically ruin said career. Is there a part of you that says, I don't recognize what's going on and God forbid somehow, some way he's rewarded for this? Where does this end?
Well, two things jump out at me, Richard, and while I've not embraced the term constitutional crisis, I'm not going to say that things are certainly going well. They're not going well. One is with respect to the president calling out people by name, whether it's Joe Biden's son or John Kerry, or sort of kind of implying that he has the power to basically use our justice system to investigate individuals, that should and does make people very uncomfortable. The president does sit on top of the executive branch, but he or she is not supposed to reach into the Justice Department and make personal decisions about who should and should not be prosecuted. So we're in an area where we've seen this happen before, and it was usually in some pretty abusive circumstances. And I'm thinking President Nixon and Watergate here. So that's one thing that absolutely should make people uncomfortable. The other part of your question about subpoenas, I mean, look, it goes against the basic idea of transparency in government, right? Whether or not the White House could drag its feet or should drag its feet or has an argument almost gets put aside to the fact that should they expose facts and individuals and testimony to the open light? I mean, if the president has nothing to hide, then why the reason to drag all this out? Why make this a public fight? Why not just turn over the information, the people, the evidence? If it vindicates him, then so be it. Let it be out in the air. But again, I can't help but think the president likes this fight. He likes keeping this going. And whether he wins or loses in the end, he seems to think that it benefits him politically. So unfortunately, I have no misconceptions that he's going to stop these tactics anytime soon.
Well, one thing I know, and I'm sure of in a day and age where I'm sure of nothing anymore, is that Trump does not like any clarity or transparency about his finances. We've all followed that he will protect with his dying breath not to get his tax returns out there. I don't believe this is as complicated as people make it. I think there's only two, maybe three possible rationales. One is, I think he's a fraud in terms of how much he's worth. I've said this since the very beginning. I think he's petrified. If people actually go through the finances, they figure out he's worth a fraction of what he says he is. And at least from what we've seen from the Times reporting, it seems to bear out that for the better part of a decade and a half, the only magic he had on the financial end was losing money. Point two, there is that mystery of what happened in 1989 where all of a sudden $53 million showed up on the right side of the ledger here when there was no rationale for where that money could have came from. And thirdly, we will find some very uncomfortable financial bedfellows here, whether it's money laundering or whatever else, that it will come to the fore. To that end, Congress is making a move. I know Mnuchin says you can't see the returns, but there does seem to be a ruling from the 1920s that says they don't have to get Mnuchin's permission. They have a right to the returns if they ask. What's your understanding as it relates to Congress getting their hands on tax returns of the president?
Well, you're right, Richard. There is a very straightforward law from the 1920s that says Congress can get any individual's tax returns that it asks for. It's full stop. Now, it doesn't give the Treasury Secretary or the IRS Commissioner any kind of discretion about whether he or she wants to turn them over or whether he or she can demand a reason from Congress. It just says Congress can ask and they shall get it. That being said, to physically get them does require the Treasury Secretary to actually release the information. Congress has no mechanism for just walking across Pennsylvania Avenue and getting those tax returns. So there does need to be some cooperation here. So what's going to happen is, it's going to go to the courts, and the courts will look at the law, and they will say, do we give this a plain reading, in which case they should be turned over, or do we have to look into the reason as to why Congress is asking for them, and then decide if that reason is good enough? Again, I think ultimately sunlight and transparency will prevail. Congress will get those tax returns, but it will not be anytime soon, and it will only be after a hard-fought battle that might go all the way to the Supreme Court. And there's no way of telling how that will work out.
And for the viewers out there who are not huge basketball fans, or at least not historical ones, I implore you to look up the Four Corners offense, because that's in effect what's going out here as we're playing the stall game in Washington, or so is the administration. Joe, I really appreciate the answers and a little bit of clarity in a otherwise very cloudy picture in Washington. Thanks for the time.
Cloudy is right, Richard. Have a wonderful night. Thanks for having me.
You too. All right, when we come back, everyone, the president, he's battling subpoenas, as we just said. He's also fighting with the media. Nothing new there. Washington Post columnist joins us to say how this has been ratcheted up another level. He'll describe why he feels he's being singled out here and punished for criticizing the president.